Despite the growing interest in the retro gaming market over the last decade, many gamers are still unaware of the major differences between PAL and NTSC games. In this video, I'll be demonstrating the visual differences between the PAL and NTSC versions of a handful of classic games from across multiple generations of consoles. Before we begin our analysis, some background context.
It may sound a little boring at first.
Chat away. I'll just amuse myself with some pornographic playing cards.
Oh.
What is NTSC and PAL? In layman's terms, up until the introduction of modern digital TV, NTSC and PAL were the two main standardizations of analog video and television signal. For NTSC regions such as North America and Japan, CRT televisions were designed to accept an electrical input of 60 Hz, producing an output refresh rate of 29.97 frames per second. While in PAL regions such as Europe and Australia, televisions accept an input of 50 Hz, producing an output refresh rate of 25 frames per second. Generally, the difference of 5 frames per second made little difference for TV broadcasts. However, this had a larger consequence for video games up until as recent as the early to mid-2000s, as the majority of games were developed by studios based in NTSC regions. If you try and play an NTSC game on a 50 Hz PAL television set, you'll end up with an image output such as this. The reason for this is that game developers in the United States and Japan hard-coded their games to run on 60 Hz displays, which produced a refresh rate of 29.97 frames per second. When you try and run this on a 50 Hz display outputting at 25 frames per second, you'll end up with timing problems due to the refresh rate and resolution being out of sync. To get around this, rather than optimize the game's code to display on 50 Hz TVs in PAL regions, most games of this era were slowed down from an output of 29.97 frames per second to display at 25 frames per second. This resulted in a slowdown of the game by 17%. Sonic the Hedgehog was known for his supersonic speed, but compare this footage of the NTSC version to the PAL release. This is an atrocious conversion, and it's sad to think that 99.9% of PAL gamers were ignorant to the fact that they were playing an inferior product. Surely those that were responsible for the PAL release knew of these issues, yet they saw no problem releasing the game and charging PAL gamers just as much, if not more, for the game than their NTSC gamer counterparts. Now, before we bash on Sega too much, Nintendo are just as guilty as Sega for not optimizing their games for PAL regions. Take Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario Kart as an example. The gameplay probably doesn't suffer nearly as much as Sonic does, but there's definitely enough of a difference that once you play the NTSC version, you won't ever want to go back to PAL. At least with The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Nintendo attempted to somewhat optimize the game for PAL regions by speeding up Link's movement. However, all the enemies and environment interactions still remain 17% slower. This also impacted many PlayStation PAL releases, including classics such as the Final Fantasy series up until the PlayStation 2 era. Of course, not all games are made in NTSC regions, with many game developers based in Europe. Most European developers optimize their games for both the PAL and NTSC markets. Many PAL version games developed by European developers were superior to their NTSC versions due to PAL having a higher vertical resolution of 625 lines versus NTSC's 525 lines.
Nice to see you.
The downside is that NTSC games didn't take advantage of this, as to account for the extra vertical resolution on PAL televisions, developers added awful looking black borders to the top and bottom frames of many PAL version releases. This resulted in not just black borders but also a squashed effect on the picture. So a game such as Super Mario 64, PAL gamers got a much fatter version of their favourite plumber. So there you have it, a breakdown of the difference between PAL and NTSC games. If you're looking to get into the retro gaming market, whether as a collector or just wanting to relive those childhood classics, make sure that you avoid PAL version at all costs.
Well, my work is done here.
What do you mean your work is done? You didn't do anything.
Didn't I?